Hearing me now. Okay, sorry about that. I just upgraded my operating system and it decided to rearrange all my settings. So this is Building Your Spiritual Immunity, and this is our last episode, our final episode. We have 9 episodes, I believe. So far, we did 9. This is the 9th one. We're in the home stretch. And I wanted to tell you, if you've enjoyed tuning in on Wednesday nights for some kind of video content, then next Wednesday we'll be starting something new. Pastor Keller, will be doing a Bible study in the book of Romans. And he's going to be doing a deep dive, he calls it, into the book of Romans. So it'll be short bursts. It won't be, hour and a half, 2 hours. It won't be that. It'll be nice, probably between 30 minutes, 45 minutes of just deep dives into the book of Romans. So if you're interested in a Bible study that goes into one of the really the thickest books in the Bible, Romans, if you want to understand the book of Romans better, which if you understand Romans, you really understand the Bible in so many ways. Tune in next Wednesday night for Pastor Keller's Bible study in that. But for tonight, we're going to do a slightly different episode for our last incident here, last episode of Building Your Spiritual Immunity. I have with me, I've kind of arranged as best as I could, and I'm not a very organized person. So when I say I've arranged as best as I could, that's a pretty low bar. I've arranged as best as I could the books that I feel have really helped me on my journey. And when I say journey, I don't just mean journey of getting to read a lot of books and know stuff, but rather there have been times in my life where I felt particularly challenged in my faith. And where it really, I was kind of, talked about this before, really felt like I was losing my grip on faith. And there's really 2 times that's happened in a very stressful way. 2 times that it really drove me to be reading a lot more. And there are some books I found in that time that really helped me get my grounding and helped me to not just answer some of those questions I might have had, but also help me to fall in love with Jesus again. And what I want to present tonight then is kind of a different recommendations for books. And you don't have to buy all these books. You don't have to read all these books. I haven't even read all these books. I've read most of the books that I'm about to present to you tonight. But for some of them, I've only read snippets of them or certain chapters or just the cover. And I've been told they're very, really good. So I will describe, which books I've read and which I haven't. And also at what levels I would recommend them. There's also plenty of online resources. And one of those is carm.org, C-A-R-M, Carm, C-A-R-M, Christian Apologetics Research Ministry, I think that stands for, .org. Lots of great articles on there that really answer a lot of the common questions that people have, and answer them in very good ways. I actually don't recommend gotquestions.org. That's the more popular site. That's the first one that shows up in Google. But there's just some things that I've seen on there that make me kind of question where they're coming from, or rather I don't really agree with their insight. But Carm is really dependable. And another a YouTube series I'd recommend, 2 actually. I would recommend the series called The Bible Project. It's a channel on YouTube where these 2 men have presented these animated videos that are a recap not only of each book of the Bible, but also a recap of concepts found in the Bible. And they're done really well, really artistically. They're really committed to the Bible. They don't question its authority. They don't question its teaching. And they present a very evangelical view of the Bible. They try not to say anything that's too specific that would kind of, if you have a certain background of theology or interpretation that you'd say, oh, rubbish to this. But they really try to concentrate on how much the Bible has to do with Jesus. So that's a great series, The Bible Project on YouTube. Also, I'd recommend Capturing Christianity, which is not I don't necessarily practice that kind of apologetics, but the gentleman who runs Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi, I think his name is, he not only knows how to make good videos that look much better than this video, but he has been able to interview some of the deepest minds that we have in the world of apologetics. and he asks great questions. He really spends a lot more time on classical apologetics and evidentialist apologetics. He doesn't spend any time on presuppositional apologetics, which is my preferred method. But if you just watch some of his videos, you get a good grounding of what some of the philosophical arguments are and how to approach some of those more heady questions. But he doesn't really do too much in terms of worldview or even more down-to-earth questions. He's really, if you're trying to go for classical sense of philosophy of God and all that. So those are some recommended resources. There are plenty more out there, and I've probably I'm just forgetting them now. There's also plenty of bad stuff out there, and I found more or less, if it looks well produced, it's probably good. I know that sounds weird, but if it looks like they put the time and effort into presenting it, then I'm more likely to trust it. And R.C. Sproul produces stuff well, even at a time where nobody's really asking to have well-produced stuff, but he was producing his stuff well. John MacArthur, his sermons are online, and they clearly know how to produce live video. If you ever see a guy who's just like doing this and he's got some whiteboard behind him and he's kind of drawing conspiracy theories, don't watch him. It's probably don't watch me. But that will follow your nose with that kind of stuff. If people seem to be not talking about Jesus when they're talking about apologetics, then they're probably doing it wrong. So without further ado, I'm going to present a few groups of books here that if you have the money to buy these books, go ahead. If you have the time to read them, go ahead. You can probably find the ebooks on sale somewhere. Maybe you can find them in your library. But these books will help to build up in you a kind of a knowledge base for how to approach not only the questions that atheists have, but the questions that people might have, your teenagers or your coworkers or whoever that you're interacting with. And if you want to be prepared, it's good to know what to say. So the first grouping, I will call this the starter pack. This is what I would give to a young person, so high school level and also college level. What I would give to a young person if I wanted to download into their heads what Christianity is about, who Jesus is, and why we can trust that Jesus is who he says he is. And I'm going to present three resources here. One is the Gospel of John. Now, I know for many people you're familiar with pocket New Testaments or pocket Bibles, the New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs. Those are great. But I've usually found that those are kind of like opening up just floodgates for a lot of people, especially if they start in Matthew. And man, Matthew, starting with genealogy, it gets really thick really quick. And there's so much Old Testament interpretation that's happening. And it can be kind of an overload. But if you give somebody a Gospel of John and you say to them, look, I'm going to read the Gospel of John at the same time you are. And let's check in once a week. Let's check in every day. Let me know what questions you have. We'll just read through it together. Nothing fancy about this. This is literally just the Gospel of John, the ESV translation, which is my favorite translation. And in here, John, the disciple, the Apostle John, has really written an intimate letter to the church of this is who Jesus is. And it's different than the other Gospels, much different. The Gospel of John is so much different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And for many people, it's their favorite Gospel because of that, because it really seems to show Jesus more intimately and also shows him exalted. It has a very high Christology. You see why people would die for this man. And you see why people would go to extremes for this man, because it's not just a man. And that's what the Gospel of John really gets across clearly. I'd also give them, and these are handed out like crazy. This is Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter. And More Than a Carpenter, Josh McDowell is taking a lot of really classic arguments about Jesus, like the trilemma, Lord, Liar, Lunatic. You maybe heard that before. He did not create that. That's C.S. Lewis's trilemma. But he really digests a lot of these things, like are the Bible records reliable? These kinds of questions that any new reader of the Bible would have. And anybody who's kind of weighing, should I spend more time on this, would say, well, how can I trust this? And I think it's helpful to give them a book from like this, a short book that they can read, like, even like in the bathroom. Who cares? Like, just they read it somewhere, and it'll give them a good, consistent witness to what some of these answers are. Because if their first move is to go online and search for answers, they're going to find so many different answers. They're going to find really bad answers. They're going to find atheist, skeptic websites that are just trying to like dismantle whatever kindling of faith they have. But giving them something like this, saying, hey, this answers a lot of questions, and if it has any questions it doesn't answer, just talk to me. And then going a little deeper, John Stott's Basic Christianity. This is a classic. In here, this is kind of a miniature theology book. It's not even 200 pages. But if you read through Basic Christianity, it's more than just Basic Christianity. You read through Basic Christianity, you will come to understand what is Christianity about, what is Jesus about, what is sin about, why do you need Jesus. It's well written. John Stott was a great writer, great thinker, and there's a reason that it's still read today. So these three books put together, these are like 400 pages of reading maybe, and really small books too. So this would read, if you can read a young adult novel, you can read these three books, the Gospel of John, More Than a Carpenter, and Basic Christianity. And then if they're really, probably for you, and if they're interested in something more, believe it or not, I recommend the Heidelberg Catechism, which is like a 450-year-old catechism. It's a set of teachings divided up into questions and answers. Kind of old school. People really don't do that anymore. But the Heidelberg Catechism, there are so many questions in here that are relevant even today. And often online, when I see people ask questions, like the basic questions of like, well, why did Jesus have to die? Or why did God do this? It's answered in here. So many of those questions are addressed in this catechism written 450 years ago by Zacharias Ursinus. Just some, it's one of the three forms of unity in the Reformed Church, but it's not like a bestseller right now. It's not like everybody has a copy, but this is really well written and very, very pastoral. The Westminster Confession is the official confession of our denomination, but the Westminster Confession is written more like a legal document, like a bunch of lawyers got together and figured out, what Christianity is. And there's really a lot of pastors coming together and really hammering out, what do we mean when we say God? But the Heidelberg Catechism is more of what is a pastoral response to those questions. So that's our starter pack. Then I have here, these are the classics. And you've probably heard of these books or read these books. And they came in this box set, which this would be a great gift for anybody, any reader. But these are C.S. Lewis's classic collection. And it has these three books. As you can see there, I have it upside down. The Great Divorce, Mere Christianity, and the Screwtape Letters. Probably the most well-known book of these three is Mere Christianity. The Great Divorce is C.S. Lewis's famous book about people taking a tour bus to hell. Mere Christianity is basically so many of the arguments Lewis made for Christianity 80 years ago now are still relevant today. And they're not all as airtight as they used to be. People have tried to debunk them. But they're memorable. If you read those books, you'll see a lot of quotations that you swear you've seen somewhere else because people quote from that book a lot. And the Screwtape Letters, which is a book that's written like correspondence. It's one demon talking to another or writing to another demon, an under-demon. And it's written in kind of a inside-out reverse way, meaning everything they're writing, you should do the opposite of it. And that's kind of the mirror reading. You should do the opposite of whatever these people are talking about. And it's a really effective way of communicating spiritual warfare and how people think and how they are led to doubt and how much the demons must be joyful whenever somebody is led to doubt. Captivating books, and C.S. Lewis is still read today for a really good reason. He was able to bring together a sense of history, a sense of religion, a sense of world religion and world philosophy, all into the voice of a storyteller. So he's able to bring together these diverse disciplines and communicate them in a way that is it's spellbinding. It's a joy to read. If C.S. Lewis wasn't a good writer, you wouldn't be reading any of it. Only eggheads and universities would ever know what these books are. But C.S. Lewis is able to write in a way that it just seems like you're reading for pleasure when you read him. Next up, I have my trio, and there's a lot of books that address these kinds of things. But these books I would call, and two of these are by the same author, These books I would call the but what about books. So when you're talking about somebody about Christianity, it's like, well, but what about what the Bible says about, homosexuality? What about what the Bible does, about slavery? Like those kinds of trying to get answers to those questions. And in these, let me present the two Paul Copan books. Paul Copan wrote this book. This is almost an old book now, from almost 20 years ago, When God Goes to Starbucks. And it has chapters addressing these kinds of specific questions. A lot of these are addressed by C.S. Lewis a long time ago, but it updates them. Miracles are unscientific. How can the Bible be so vindictive in places? And it is. If you read through the Psalms, it's very vindictive. Aren't the biblical holy wars just like Islamic jihad? These are pretty common rebuttals. Those are not things that, if somebody has those questions, typically that's a cover for deeper emotional questions. But for yourself, you might have not wondered about those things. Why does God seem to condone genocide in the Old Testament? What is that about? And Paul Copan addresses a lot of those questions in his other book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God, by Paul Copan. And he is trying to, in this book, explain some of the things that in the Old Testament that we really shy away from, I think, in the evangelical church and the Christian church today, is we seem to present this version of the Bible where in the Old Testament God was really, really angry. In the New Testament he's all loves and kisses. Not the case. No. God is loving in the Old Testament and he's wrathful in the New Testament. He's both, in both. So Paul Copan goes through and addresses some of those objections people have to the Old Testament God. People might say things like, oh yeah, I love Jesus. That's all cool, but what about this other stuff? Have you read this stuff? And they might quote a specific verse to you and out of context and think that unravels the Bible. It's like, no, we've thought about this. So if you've ever had questions yourself about that, what to do with the Old Testament, Paul Copan says God a Moral Monster is a good place to start. And then the sequel to The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. And this book is not the famous one. The famous one is The Case for Christ. But this book is also very useful, The Case for Faith, because he addresses in here a lot of the similar questions of, how can you worship God if he condones such and such? Or it's offensive to claim that Jesus is the only way to God, the exclusivity of Christ, which is actually probably when the book was written, not all the people were saying that, but now they're saying it more. So those are three how come books or what about books, when people bring up elements of the Bible that they find offensive. I'm going to present now mind-blowing books, or paradigm shifters. And when I say paradigm shifters, I know that's a cliche, but these are books that have really changed my thinking. And there are some books, some secular books that have changed my thinking, and I'll get to those. But these are Christian books that have really changed my thinking and gotten me to think in different ways. The first is The Universe Next Door by James Sire. He also wrote a book, I believe it was called Why Should We Believe Anything at All? And James Sire, he writes about worldview and basically how to, or introducing all these concepts of different philosophies and how they defeat themselves really, and how the Christian worldview is really the only one that's consistent and can outlast the rest of them. So this is getting more heady. This is more of a philosophical book, but still very accessible. It's not written like philosophy. And if you're interested in worldview, if you're interested to know more about that, it's a good starting point. Then this next book is actually more of a theology book. This was required reading in my seminary because one of our professors wrote this book, so we all had to read it. But it turns out it's a good book anyways, and he's not paying me to say this. Far as the Curse is Found by Michael D. Williams. There's a few Michael Williams who write Christian books. Michael D. Williams, Far as the Curse is Found, The Covenant Story of Redemption. And if you've never read a theology book, and what theology is really, there's two kinds of theology. Theology is the study of God. You might know at least that much. But there's different spheres within theology. Like in systematic theology tries to take the different concepts found in the Bible and explain them throughout the Bible. So, for example, what does the Bible say about pneumatology, the Holy Spirit, Christology, Jesus Christ? Harmatology, sin. What does the Bible say about sin in the Old Testament, New Testament? So in systematic theology, you're really starting at the concept and then going and looking for where it is in the Bible. And we can do that because the Bible was written by one person, God. So it would make sense that the way he talked about sin in one area is the way he talks about it in another area. And a lot of classic theology books are systematic theologies. So, if you ever read Louis Berkhoff, his systematic theology, very accessible theology if you want to read systematics. Well, this is a biblical theology. Biblical theology goes kind of in the reverse direction. It just reads the Bible and then sees the Bible in this linear, unraveling story. And instead of trying to start at concepts, it starts at what does the text say? And then knowing that the text ends in a certain way, then if the text says this in Genesis, what is it pointing us to? Where does it end? How does this all have to do with each other? It's more integrated in how it reads the Bible. And in this book, it really is able to communicate the idea of covenant theology, which there's other books about covenant theology, but this book I found really helpful in relating how to read the Bible, how to understand the story of the Bible. And remember, in apologetics, you're defending your faith. And if you don't know what you believe, it's hard to defend it. So it's good to know not just your Bible and where to find certain verses, but how things connect and how the story goes. So when you're talking to somebody and they ask, well, why did God put the tree in the garden? Well, you know where that ends up. You know how the story of redemption goes. So you're able to say well, I can't tell you exactly why God put the tree in the garden, but I know that he had redemption in mind, that he didn't put that tree in there to see us suffer. He put that tree in there to redeem us in some way that I can't really explain, but I know where the story goes. It's the story of redemption. So this, I recommend. It's a little thicker than some of these other books, but it's easy to read, not as difficult to read as other theologies. And these two books by James K.A. Smith, or Jamie Smith, as he likes to call himself. And this book, I remember reading this book in a airport, Desiring the Kingdom. It's part of a series, a 3-part series. The second, third, whatever, of books, the 2 and 3, they're okay. This first one is mind-blowing. This is a game changer. I read this book. I wasted a highlighter on this book. It just constantly, I had to start highlighting what I wasn't going to highlight. Just that much insight. And in this book, James K. Smith is really trying to establish how religion is everywhere, and we're all being formed liturgically. If you've ever been part of a church, you know what a liturgy is. It's the order of service or the form that the worship service takes. But there's cultural liturgies out there as well. There's things that we all do because we live in a certain secular culture. And that secular culture is liturgizing us. It is enculturating us in ways that we can't even tell. And if we don't notice those things, then we're going to start living lives like any worldly person, but just with a different set of beliefs. And is that really what God wants? Is that really Christianity? So it's a great book at really revealing and unveiling that side of how we've thought about Christianity and how much it's so much more than just a right set of beliefs. And I found it a fascinating book, not necessarily for apologetics, but for being able to pick out the religion that people already practice. So if I'm talking to somebody and they're like, I'm not religious, I'd be like, you're pretty religious. You might not go to a church on Sunday, but you go to a mall every Saturday, right? You might not give money to a church, but you give money to, this shrine in the mall. You might not take home a relic, but you take home some merchandise. And you go back the next week and you look for your fulfillment there. To the point where, people will joke, I need some retail therapy. Like, it's really retail religion that you're practicing. But that book has been helpful in kind of identifying those things. So it's a good conversation starter. And then I've mentioned this book before, Charles Taylor, How Not to Be Secular. This is James K. Smith's reading of Charles Taylor's Secular Age. A Secular Age, the book is like 1,000 pages long, and I'm never going to read it. But Jamie Smith is able to digest it very well. That's Charles Taylor there. But Jamie Smith digests this book very well, and it's another book for helping you understand how we got to where we are in the world right now. It's kind of heady, but if you like that kind of stuff, it's like popping, just trail mix Like you're getting some like cashews in there. Oh, that's good. That's healthy. Every now and then you get an M&M. Like, oh, that's sweet. That feels good. Like that's how I felt reading this book. It's like, it's just like, man, this is filling and it's delicious. So a lot of my metaphors have to do with food for some reason. The next section are education in world religions, and I feel like I'm setting up a class here. But you don't need to know, and I've said this in different ways. You don't need to know everybody else's beliefs. All right, you don't need to know what every Muslim believes. You're not defending Islam. You don't need to know why Islam is wrong. You know that Christianity is right. All right, that's a very presuppositional way of thinking. But if you're a Christian, then you're saying that you believe the Bible is true. And if you believe the Bible is true, then you're not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to defend it against other religions. They're wrong. Now that sounds circular and really arrogant, right? So it might be helpful to know a little bit about other religions. In case you are speaking to somebody who's maybe a Buddhist, and they start talking to you about their beliefs, and you don't know how to make heads or tails of it, or you're not really sure to identify what parts overlap with Christianity. They might use terms differently. You have no idea that the concept they're trying to get across is actually a Christian concept that's been embedded into New Age Buddhism. And I've had these kinds of conversations sometimes where somebody will mention something, and I'll be like, that's actually Christian. It sounds like a Christian became a Buddhist at some point in the 70s and wrote a book, and now it's a Buddhist thought, but it's actually a Christian thought. So it is helpful to have at least some basic knowledge of world religions. And you could look this up online. You don't need books for this. But I found these books to be helpful. This one being the most helpful. Christianity and World Religions. Written by Derek Cooper. And I'm not sure who Derek Cooper is, but he did a great job of writing this book. It's really written like a textbook. So it has wide margins and notes in the margins. But what he tries to do in every chapter is relate the beliefs of that religion in a respectful way. He's not trying to say, look at these idiots that believe this. It's like, no, this is their culture. This is what they believe. This is what they practice. And then how does that overlap with Christianity? How can a Christian speak to them? How should a Christian speak to a Hindu person? How should a Christian speak to a Muslim person? And understanding that Muslims do not think in the same way. It's not that Muslims are like Christians, except they have different terms or believe in the wrong God. It's like they think in a very different way. If you don't know how they think, then you're not going to get very far in a conversation, or you're just going to say something that is just offensive in the wrong way. The only time you want to offend somebody is offend them with Jesus. If they're offended by the gospel, great, they should be. But if they're offended by anything, if they're offended by you being disrespectful, that's not a biblical manner of speaking to people. So Christianity and World Religions. Really helpful book. I enjoyed it a lot. This book I have not read, but it comes highly recommended, and it's by a gentleman who you might have heard of, Nabil Qureshi. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. But he was a gentleman who died a couple of years ago at a young age. Ex-Muslim man who wrote a few books about Islam. He toured with Ravi Zacharias in some instances, and he was able to kind of unveil and reveal a lot of beliefs about Islam that he used to believe, or that he grew up within. And I've not read this book, but he has in here more trying to get a better way of talking about Islam and particularly terrorism. And I think a knee-jerk reaction that Christians have that doesn't really get very far is remarking on 2 or 3 violent things that they've seen recently in the news and saying, like, see, Islam is wrong because it's a religion of violence. Talking to a Muslim person who hasn't engaged in violence, that's just going to be like, yeah, those are violent people. It's like saying like everybody who owns a gun shoots somebody. It's like, that's not true. But how can you talk about that in a way that's actually constructive? Where is that found in the Quran? Is it actually condoned? In what ways? How can you speak about it intelligently without just in a knee-jerk way? And with the goal of really being revealing to Muslim people Jesus, who to them would be Isa. So, and then next, this is the Facilitator's Guide to the Video Series, but this is also a book, Jesus Among Other Gods by Ravi Zacharias. This is his most famous book. Ravi Zacharias, in a lot of ways, was like a modern C.S. Lewis. He did not really introduce a lot of new material, but he was great at addressing questions live, in person. Great at being able to use his amazing mind to really form coherent answers. and responses to questions about Christianity, and in a lot of ways update some of the language that C.S. Lewis might have used. And here, more than Lewis didn't really spend a lot of time trying to compare religion or compare Christianity to other world religions, but Ravi Zacharias here shows the exclusivity of Christ. And Ravi Zacharias grew up in a Hindu context, so he understands what it's like to be a Christian in a place that has so many different beliefs. He made a video series on it. That's also worth watching if you lead a small group. It's a great way to introduce new questions for people, introduce new ideas, and communicate about them. Getting into headier stuff now. Christianity at the Religious Roundtable. This is a deeper version of the Christianity and World Religions, written by Timothy Tennant. This goes a bit deeper and also would have very defined examples of this is how an evangelical should reply to a Sunni Muslim. This is what you would say. I think this would be more of training for missionaries. So if I was a missionary going into a particular context, and I didn't really know where, if I was going to a country where you find different branches of Islam, or you find a mix of Islam and Hindu and Buddhist, this would be a great book to pick up and really be able to dive deep into some of those things. This book is not written by a Christian. This is written by, I believe, either agnostic or atheist professor, Stephen Prothero. Wrote this book a few years ago called God is Not One. And he writes about puts it up there, the 8 rival religions that run the world. And what he tried to do in this book is, and this is written for a liberal audience. This is written for secular people. This is not geared towards Christians. But he's a professor of religion at Boston University. I don't know if you've heard, Boston has a few colleges in it, and Boston University is one of them. But he was very annoyed at how people would write about Christianity in secular circles. And they would write about religion as if they were all the same, as if Christianity was just the Western version of Islam or Judaism, as if Christianity was just another spin on what you'd find in Eastern religions. And as a professor of religion, this enraged him. He's like, are you crazy? Have you actually read these? So he gives kind of a profile of these 8 different religions, and he goes into religions you might not even ever heard of, like Yoruba religions. If you live in Miami, you've heard of Yoruba religions because Santeria is a Yoruba religion mixed with Catholicism. Yoruba religions were brought over by slaves that were brought over against their will to the New World, and they preserved a lot of their beliefs embedded in Christian talk so they could secretly keep practicing their religion. But it's still a widespread religion in Africa right now. A lot of people practice Yoruba. You wouldn't know it. But he goes through and he has kind of a rubric of what every religion finds wrong, what they all have in common. The only thing every religion has in common is that they all think that something's wrong with the world. If they didn't think that, they wouldn't have gotten up in the morning and written a book about religion. No religion would have started if people didn't believe something's wrong with the world. And he's coming from a background of that none of these are true, right? So he doesn't really give preference to any of them. But he then goes into how does each religion address the problem of what is wrong, who are the saints in each religion, and who are the villains, and what is the way to live the best life. So it's really trying to pay the devil his due, so to speak, and giving each religion a fair shot at explaining their beliefs. You can tell in places what he's a fan of. I can tell he's a fan of Taoism and Buddhism, which a lot of liberal professors would be. But he gives a fair shake to Christianity, and I think even he found in his study that Christianity is way more diverse than it's given credit for typically in the media. So this is a thick book. You don't have to read this, but if you want a atheist agnostic perspective on world religion, this is the book to go to. This next set of books. So now we're getting into more of a realm. We're going to get back to Christian books. We're getting more into a realm of if you wanted to have a college education, but you only had a weekend. This series of books, you can hopefully still find these on Amazon, the Introducing series. And these were very simply produced books, and they have lots of drawings. They're black and white, not incredibly good drawings, but they try to explain different concepts and philosophers in digestible ways. And the problem with that, of course, is you're basically getting the digest of whoever wrote it. And there could be 30 guys who read this and be like, that's nothing. That's not what Hegel said at all. But on balance, I've found these books, as I've tried to verify, is this really what these people said? This series has been very good at sticking close to what these people actually said. So, philosopher Hegel gave us the Hegelian dialectic. He was, I believe, a Lutheran minister, or studying to be a Lutheran minister, and came up with this idea that history is basically thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that is, you take two opposites, they fight, and then they create a new thing. And then that new thing becomes the opposite of something else. And then they fight, and they create a new thing. And then that new thing, and that's just how history goes. And there's constantly a struggle, constantly battle. I'm going to give you a sidebar on Hegelianism in this right here. What that ends up with, though, is you end up with kind of fatalism of like, well, history was always going to happen that way. History is always a struggle. Over time, people would pick up on this concept and turn it into Marxism. History is class struggle. People would read it back into the early church. Oh, Christianity is really Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians fighting it out and creating a new Christianity, a synthesis of Christianity, which was really more of the Gentile Christianity. So these concepts are core to how so many people think today, but very few people could even name this guy. But in this book, you will learn about some of those concepts that have been applied over history. This one on Foucault. A lot of Foucault, I call him the breakfast cereal philosopher, because his concepts only took a couple of generations to end up in Saturday morning cartoons, eating some breakfast cereal, and all of a sudden you see a commercial that says knowledge is power. That's Foucault. Jacques Derrida. I'm not going to try to explain Jacques Derrida, but if you want to know more about him, read that. Heidegger. I'm going to speed through these now. Time, introducing the concept. You didn't know that you needed a book, did you? Consciousness. This is a great one. What I got from this book is that all of our philosophers and scientists agree we cannot explain consciousness. And then Camus. Camus is one of my favorite philosophers because he is, at least in his writing, consistent. Maybe in his life he wasn't consistent with his philosophy. But I've often told people, if I wasn't a Christian, I would be whatever Camus was. Because he seems to have gotten as close to how you're supposed to live in an indifferent universe as you're, as consistent as you get, which is kind of depressing, right? But I am a Christian. As Calvin would say, lucky for me. Now, here are some books that I'm going to call this what the other side is saying, all right? These are books, these are all written by, as far as I know, non-Christians. And in many ways, these books have helped me not only to understand the world through different lenses, not to say that the Bible doesn't fulfill that, but rather that certain concepts in these books that have actually helped explain human behavior in ways that the Bible says, but just says it in words that are applicable in more conversations with people. So in some of these, I very much disagree with, and I'm just bringing them out here to show you this is what the people have read. This is who you're talking to. When you're at a party and somebody tells you, well, I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic, ask them if they've read these books. The first is The Social Animal by David Brooks. David Brooks is a agnostic Jew. He's been getting closer to Christianity. In his most recent book, he actually talked about like he's turned on to the idea. He's not far from the kingdom, as they say. But in this book, this is his first book that was probably his most famous one still. Fascinating book. There's a lot of social science, social psychology about human behavior. But a lot of it is fascinating, not just in that it's kind of like reading a podcast. If you're listening to podcasts, most of them are just whatever this book was about. But it is also how many secular people try to understand the world through evolutionary psychology. That, well, of course we act that way. We just evolved that way, or that's just our psychology. But the more that you understand how people work, the less that evolution is able to explain it. And I think David Brooks started getting closer to that as he wrote more books. He got to the point where he couldn't really justify why live a moral life. If we are really just, hairless apes, there's no call to live any better life than the hairless apes. So that, The Social Animal, fascinating read. Jonathan Haidt. I recommend any pastor read this book. Read it right now. This Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian. I think another liberal Jewish professor. Was a professor at UVA. I'm not sure if he's still there. David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times. And in this book, I'm going to give you the thumbnail sketch of this book. And the subtitle says a lot. Why good people are divided by politics and religion. Basically, he tries to go into moral foundations, or really the foundations that people appeal to without knowing it, to make their moral claims. So why is it that perfectly reasonable people can have vastly different opinions on the same issue, be completely different political parties, yet happen to share actually a lot of the same values? Like they wouldn't say that they're against people living happy lives. So why is it that they so clash so much? And a very overly simplistic answer is like, well, one side's just evil. It's like, not necessarily. One side might be misguided, but what if both sides are misguided? And what if both sides are kind of blindly appealing to things that aren't actually good foundations? It's a fascinating book to read. Really helps you to understand when you get into discussions and kind of arguments, I guess, especially on Facebook. You start to see like, okay, this is really a moral foundation kind of conversation. This isn't about really right or wrong anymore. There's another book that I don't have on me called How to Think by Alan Jacobs. Similarly, pick that up. If you plan to get in arguments on Facebook, you should read How to Think by Alan Jacobs. These next few books. Okay, so this book came out 15 years ago. This was a ground shifting, tectonic plate shifting book. This became required reading in almost every college. It came out I think I had graduated by the time it was published, so I read it on my own a couple of years later. But this, I'm pretty sure every college student has read this book. Jared Diamond, who's an atheist, professor at UCLA, I believe. This book tries to explain why is it that Europe colonized the Americas and not the other way around. Which seems like an obvious statement. It's like, well, Europe had boats. Europe had guns. Europe had swords that you couldn't break. But his question is like, yeah, why did they have those things? Why did they get to those things before the Native Americans in the Americas? Why wasn't it a fair fight? So I'm not going to, I'll spoil it for you. Location. The geography of the Levant, of the Mediterranean, Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, that geography lends itself to economic development more than geography of the Americas. And fascinating just how the book gets really boring. Like he goes into historical crop gatherings of over the years and whatever the kind of corn that certain fishermen use. Who cares? But he cares. And he really went into a lot of detail. The reason I bring it up though is in this book, and remember many people have read this book, he presents an atheistic view of history that seems to stick. Oh, it wasn't that Jerusalem is the holy city and God is working in this part of the world and then God sends out the gospel around the world. That's not the story at all. It's just a story of who can get to guns faster. And the Europeans got to guns faster. And that's why Christianity became the religion of the world, because we had boats and guns. So that atheistic understanding of history is very easy to swallow and be like, oh, that explains it. And it kind of demystifies and disenchants the history we've lived. So you can say like, oh, God acts in history. And somebody who's read that book, it's like, no, it was mostly just crops. This book's pretty famous. There's a few other famous atheist books, but this is the one I've read. The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I read this during a faith crisis, and it was very consoling in a weird way. Because in my faith crisis, I was just going through a lot of self-pity and a lot of anger at God, and this book was like, yeah, I should be angry at God. And then upon revisiting it and reading through it again, I was like, this is not very well written. This is what a middle schooler would write. Or the way somebody has put it is, imagine if a biologist was writing a cookbook. It's like, yeah, they can tell you all the biology of all these foods. You wouldn't cook with that book, though. And that's really what Richard Dawkins has done here. It's a biologist tries to understand theology and approaches it from the aspect of how a biologist would understand it. Yeah, that's how a biologist understands theology. I would not go there for theology, though. But there's many things in this book that the new atheism movement really was not started by this book, but this is like the champion book of it, and became this kind of almost guidebook for so many atheists, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, and presents in it some arguments, some anti-apologetics or atheist apologetics of how to dismantle common Christian arguments. It doesn't do a great job of dismantling them, but it does a good enough job that certain people, I would say, seekers, very weak Christians, could be swayed by it. People going through seasons of doubt, like I was, or atheists and agnostics who really just want to justify their lack of belief. That book would be very helpful to them because it gives you these kind of very easy to understand arguments against Christianity. And Richard Dawkins goes after Christianity. He really does. He hates Christianity. He hates all religion. And he's of the idea that if you got rid of religion, there will be a better place. Which is the opposite of what this guy says. This is Tom Holland, who grew up Anglican, but is, I think, an atheist. Might be changing his mind now. But Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, different Tom Holland, professor of history at Oxford, I want to say. He has written a bunch of history books. Tom Holland has written a lot of history books about Rome, and I'm not able to find what his pedigree is here, but he has a few awards in history. And in all his writing on history, he kept coming upon this thread that history without Christianity would have been so brutal that the Christians weren't stumbling upon incredibly peaceful Romans or incredibly peaceful tribes and then, radicalizing them to be these mean Christians. No, the ancient world was brutal. It was savage. It was hateful. There was no reason to ever find any value in the weak. That idea of finding value in the weak is a Christian idea, a very Christian idea, and not found anywhere else. And it's very unique. And if you like the idea of the dignity of the weak and the helpless, then you have Christianity to thank for that. You are enculturated in a Christian world. So Dominion goes through basically the history of the world, and it is, end point is, without Christianity, we would never have gotten to woke culture, or the culture of we need to look out for social justice and look out for this, look out for that. And today, people will hurl insults to Christianity for not being woke enough, but woke would have never happened if Christianity never happened. So fascinating book, especially for really, I want to say, strengthening your faith, even though this man is not a Christian, just to see how Christianity has changed the world. Then this book, I would say this is the new God delusion. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I think he's a professor at Israeli, maybe University of Tel Aviv, University of Jerusalem, professor of world history. He's in the Department of History at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So he is a good writer. I'll give him that. He's a captivating writer. This is he has C.S. Lewis skills of where you read him and you enjoy just his style. I disagree with so much of what he says in here, but I enjoy his style. And what he's done here is gone from the Big Bang to now in not that many pages. And in a very well-produced book, this is the hardcover version, but these pages are high quality, and there's color pictures inside. I mean, it feels like an important book. And what Yuval Harari has accomplished in this book is really given the new atheists something to hold on to. And this is a point I want to make quickly. I've made this point before. The new atheists, the popular term 10 years ago, that was a group of people who were really angry about Christianity and religion in general. And it was really, a lot of it was a response to Islamic terrorism and how even liberal people, like Bill Maher, for example, Bill Maher doesn't have an axe to grind against Christianity. He has an axe to grind against religion. Dennis Miller, who is conservative, he has an axe to grind against religion. So and they're not saying, I'm not saying they're part of the new atheist movement, but that this kind of trend of atheism amongst baby boomers had this very pointed edge to it. But millennials and some Gen Xers and Zoomers for sure, millennials are not that angry about, Christianity is more irrelevant than anything else. It's not that, if only those Christians weren't in control. They're kind of not. You can write news stories about how evangelicals put Trump in the White House, but you still look at the numbers. There aren't that many of them. There's no stranglehold of Christianity on this country. So the new atheism is basically just apathy. It's not even agnosticism. People aren't even wondering. They don't care. They found alternate ways of explaining the world. And this book is an alternate way of explaining the world. And in many ways, it makes sense. And it's very pitiless, indifferent. He's not passionate about anything. He basically just says, like, this is the way it is. Take it or leave it. And he tries to back it up with science, with history. And if you didn't know better, you'd be like, oh, he nailed it. That's it. I don't have to think about those things ever again. I'm going to go make myself a sandwich. The problem, though, in my reading of it, there's some things he talks about that I'm like, that's fascinating. I never knew that. But then when he talks about, like, the history of Christianity, I'm like, wait a second. I know that. And that's not how it went. And I've read that other people have that problem with him in whatever realm. Like, he writes about geology. Geologists have read this book and said, wait a second, that's not how geology works. So Yuval Harari might be getting away with just being broad enough that he can, sway a lot of people and not really being an expert in anything. But it's still a captivating read, and people still read it. No matter how wrong it might be, so many people are reading it. It is a bestseller. You go to the airport, it's on the bestseller list still. People are still reading this book. And this book is really informing a lot of people on how to view the world. So you don't have to read it. But look at the endorsement here. Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's part of this alternate history of the world that helps to explain the world through a completely atheistic lens without ever coming across as angry or bitter. And that's really what people, I think a lot of people desire. They want to live the life they want to live, and they don't want to come across angry or bitter about it. So, a few more books, and I'll have to rapid fire these. Christianity and Science. There's a book by C. John Collins, better known as Jack Collins, was one of my professors. He wrote a book called Science and Faith that I think I might have lost my copy of it. Get that book, Science and Faith. But this is another book he wrote that's very interesting. Did Adam and Eve really exist? It's a an odd question, right? But Jack Collins believes in intelligent design. So he's not a young earth creationist. So a lot of people have said, like, oh, then you must not believe that Adam and Eve existed. It's like, au contraire. He does believe Adam and Eve existed. But how do you explain that in an intelligent design framework? So he really tries to scientifically and historically explain the concept of a first pair. And kind of, you don't have to be a Christian to believe that there was a first, there had to have at some point have been the first two humans, right? Even if you believe in evolution, at some point there was the first two humans. And then we have The Language of God. I've brought up this book before by Francis Collins. It's a guy that mapped the human genome. And this is a great book. The year after I read God Delusion, this was one of the books I read that helped to kind of rescue my faith in a lot of ways. Because he's able to very intelligently and very scientifically speak about the credibility of the Christian story. I'm going to tear through these. These are the heavy hitters. All right. If you want to get into apologetics and you're not just looking to, answer a few questions, but you actually want to be able to explain it, then these are the heavy hitters that I would recommend. I read this book recently. This is a high school level book or a college level. This is an easy to read book, but Rebecca McLaughlin she can write well, and she's able to explain some concepts that have been around a while now. Some already been answered in other books, but in updated terms and in ways that are really captivating. I keep using that word. The Reason for God. This is an amazing book. Now, Confronting Christianity is kind of just a take on Reason for God. You could read this and not have to read that, but you have to read this. Tim Keller wrote this book about 12 years ago. This is probably the most common apologetics book that people read today. People who can't stand Calvinism, can't stand Presbyterians, can't stand old, smart white people, read this book and love it. Doesn't matter where they stand on theologically different plane than Tim Keller or whatever. Like, this is the book on apologetics. And he really takes an approach to it that is easy to access for believers and non-believers, because he has spoken to a lot of skeptics. And this is kind of how he would talk to them. Then there's the follow-up book, Making Sense of God. And this book is really would be the prequel to this book. He wrote this afterwards, but this is more of a deeply philosophical book. This kind of starts before the beginning. And for a lot of people who read The Reason for God, for if they were, grad students or people who just have read more philosophy, they found The Reason for God lacking because it seemed to be just popular level and only addressing questions and not concepts. And in this book, Tim Keller addresses concepts and goes deep into history of concepts and the kind of ideas of moral values that is more satisfying read if you're looking for more abstract reasoning. And this is a classic. This contains 3 books, and these are amazing books. The Francis Schaeffer trilogy, or the trilogy as I call it. The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, and He Is There and He Is Not Silent. The God Who Is There was, I think, Schaeffer's most famous book in apologetics. So many of his concepts come out of that book, and I've used a lot of those concepts, and that's one of the first books in apologetics that I read. I can't recommend this book enough, and this is a deal to get those 3 books in one. But if you can only find one book, go look for The God Who Is There. And getting closer to the end, these are a few books that I found to be helpful to people who, these are kind of more niche kind of books. And there's one book that I can't find my copy of, probably because I gave it away or I lost it. I probably lost it. Unapologetic by Francis Schaeffer. Unapologetic by Francis Schaeffer. Unlike any book on apologetics I've ever read. It's more of an emotional book, which I think is the right approach today for a lot of people, but maybe just the right approach. That people who have questions, they're emotional questions. And Schaeffer has a way of writing that makes you really fall in love with Jesus and fall in love more with the person of Jesus than with answers. I don't have a copy of it with me. I wish I did, but Unapologetic by Francis Schaeffer. I don't agree with everything in that book. There's 3 pages in that book that, I don't agree with. Maybe you don't agree with. He's British, so he has different views on certain topics. But the rest of it is just incredible, especially this treatment of sin, and his chapter about Jesus is phenomenal. Nothing like it. Another book I'd recommend, this is for people who are struggling. I think if you are a Christian who's been struggling and you're really having trouble getting back to God. Mike McGargue's, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Finding God in the Waves. I lost my faith and found it again through science. He has a podcast called Science Mike. Mike's a bit liberal. I would not follow him on everything. Like I don't mean liberal politically, I mean liberal theologically. But he has in here just this great story of his journey of faith, and also this amazing writing on how prayer works and how prayer is even basically, if you want to believe in God, fake it till you make it. That sounds horrible, but if you pray, even if you don't believe in God, and you pray for 3 weeks straight, you're going to start believing in God. That's just how your brain works. And an atheist would say oh, so it's your brain tricking you. And you could say or God created us that way. That the more we reinforce those muscles, the more they're able to respond. This is a book for teenagers. Can I ask that? This has a few questions that teenagers would have, and it addresses them in a way that's more accessible for teenagers. This is really, if you have a middle school or high school youth group, this would be a good book to have. Love's an Orientation by Andrew Marin. There are a lot of books on dealing with the question of homosexuality and what does the Bible say about it. I would recommend the book by Sam Allberry, Is God Anti-Gay? I can't find my copy. It's an amazing book. Sam Allberry is a celibate gay Anglican priest who stands against the British Anglican Church and their stance. The British Anglican Church is very liberal on homosexuality, but Sam Allberry stands against it, and he's written an amazing book about it. But Love is an Orientation. Andrew Marin basically spent a decade embedded in the gay community in Chicago. He does not take a side. There is no page of this book where Andrew Marin says, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. All he does in this book is communicate the things that he heard. The things that he heard from gay people, ex-Christian, people who wanted to wish they could still be Christian, but had to leave the church because of their feelings. He is just communicating what he's heard from them. He is not trying to pick a fight. He's not trying to pick a side. And I applaud him for that. I applaud him for just going and he went to Wheaton College. He's a conservative Christian. And he just wanted to hear those stories. And he communicates that in this book. in this book, Divine Sex, by Jonathan Grant, this is kind of a philosophical take on what sex is about. And what I found is, at least for addressing the topic of sex with anybody, really, of teenagers especially, that you need to have a positive ethic. Not meaning like a positive view of sex, like duh, everybody does. But a positive ethic meaning, what is sex for? Not just what is sex not for, which typically Christians, the angle we use is like, oh, well, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. Sex belongs in marriage. It's like, why? Why? And Divine Sex really tries to build that positive ethic. Why is that ethic there? Like, why did God set it up that way? So, a little philosophical. It's not going to be something you sit down with a teenager, and talk through the book. But it gives you some underpinnings. It gives you some ways of talking about sex that leave it at more than just, don't do this. Now, these are the last few books. And these are probably the deepest books here. I'm going to call these the, You Wanted to Know. The You Wanted to Know books. All right. Hell on Trial by Robert Peterson. Robert Peterson is a systematic theologian. He was one of my professors at Covenant. And, nobody wants to write this book. Nobody wants to write a book in defense of hell. But he's collected a few essays. This isn't just Robert Peterson, but about the belief of hell, the historical belief of hell, and why it's necessary, and why to drift from that belief actually starts to unravel Christianity. If you don't have a hell, you don't have punishment for sin, you don't have wrath of God, you have a Jesus who didn't really need to die. So if you wanted to know, there's a book, Hell on Trial. There's plenty of books on it now, but that's the one I have. Then Reinventing Jesus. This came out kind of as an answer to the Bart Ehrman book, Misquoting Jesus. But this was a popular book 15 years ago after Da Vinci Code came out, and everybody was like, oh, the Bible is totally full of loopholes and contradictions. And this book is a great popular level book of, well, no, this is how the Bible was put together. This is why we can trust it. Reliability, historical reliability of the Gospels. This is a heavy book. But Craig Blomberg's book is the only book you need on why you can believe that the Gospels are true. Now, maybe you don't need that, but maybe someone you know needs that. Or maybe you wanted to know, like, why do we believe the Gospels are true? Gary Habermas, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Gary Habermas is the leading authority on just the very much cold case Christianity kind of approach to the resurrection of Jesus. And this is an easy to read book. It looks long, but this is actually a kind of popular level book. And finally, this is the thickest book of all the ones I've shown you tonight. N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. Okay, if there's any book that is the defining book of the resurrection and all the scholarship we've had in the resurrection to this day, it is this book. All right? It's part of a series he has. There's other books about Jesus and the time period that he's written. And N.T. Wright, I don't agree with everything he says, but as my professors have said, and as I say to you now, eat the meat, spit out the bones. If you read a book, you don't have to believe everything it says, especially if they come from a tradition where just weirdly interpret a certain thing. Somebody can be wrong about one thing and right about everything else. So N.T. Wright might be wrong about a couple of things in his theology. Maybe you know about those things. But in what he's written here, no person has presented such a defense. Like Gary Habermas, like this is what he does for a living, right? N.T. Wright does other stuff for a living, and just in his spare time wrote a book that really dwarfs Gary Habermas' book. But this is anything you would ever ask about the resurrection or the text of the time and key passages. And there's so much more that N.T. Wright has written even. But that book, if you really wanted to know, here it is. So there's plenty more books out there. These are just some that I have that I've read, that I've consulted. And I don't present these books as be like, oh, hey, look how much I know. Because I've read these, and what I found out is I don't know as much as I thought I did. And reading does that to you, where you start to see, where else you could go with it, and what questions are still not being answered, and what questions might never be answered. But if you're looking for resources in getting to know your Bible more, getting to know historically, theology more, the history of the world more, and seeing more about the faith that you claim you have, they claim the faith that you believe, read some of these books, check them out, or check out books like them. And you will be able to have an answer, a response, a reason for the hope that is in you. Thank you for watching for the last 9 weeks or so. For you faithful that have watched, or if you only watched a couple, if you only watched this one, thank you for watching. And it was a pleasure getting to do this and getting to communicate some of these ideas. There's so many things I didn't talk about, but maybe we'll do this again sometime. And again, next week, we're starting our class on Romans. Pastor Kent Keller will be doing that class, a deep dive into Romans, starting next week, same time. And from there, let me pray and wave goodbye. Heavenly Father, thank you for the technology that you've provided for us, that we live in a time where we can do this. We thank you, Lord, for your revealed will in your word. It's all we need. But we also thank you for just all the Christian brothers and sisters that you've brought up who have been able to write such beautiful words about you that help to strengthen our faith, help to answer questions, and hopefully, Lord, have helped, even in this time, to draw people to you and to cause people to doubt their doubts. We thank you for all these things in your Son's holy name. Amen. All right. Good night, guys.